From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Global condemnation follows Trump's suggestion he'd encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to NATO allies that don't spend enough. Leaders blasting his words as appalling, irresponsible, and a mistake. We'll get more reaction from retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt.
Donald Trump asked the Supreme Court to keep his election trial on hold while he appeals a ruling on presidential immunity. We'll discuss an important week ahead for Trump's legal challenges with former Watergate prosecutor Nick Akerman.
And the Super Bowl brings a Chiefs win, an RFK Jr. ad, a Dark Brandon appearance, and no Taylor Swift endorsement. We'll have your political post-game analysis. And Joe, obviously on this Monday, a lot of us attempting to recover from Super Bowl Sunday, but the news slows down for no one, and certainly former President Trump has very much been in the news today.
Yeah, how about that? Of course, he was all weekend with the comments on NATO in South Carolina, the next big contest, of course, in this campaign. But it's news from the Supreme Court that's driving the headlines this afternoon, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that is where we will begin. Joining us this evening are Bloomberg's Greg Stohr, Dan Flatley, and Kate Ackley. Greg, of course, covers the Supreme Court for us here in Washington. So, Greg, let's begin with you. Donald Trump has now officially asked the 9 justices to keep on hold his criminal trial here in Washington. While this immunity question is still very much still a question, he's going to likely appeal this. What does the court do from here? What are its options?
So it has a number of options. So if you recall, last week, a federal appeals court, a 3-judge panel said you do not get criminal immunity. That's not a thing. Presidents are not entitled to avoid a criminal trial because of actions they took while president. He is now asking the Supreme Court to put that ruling on hold so that the trial will not go forward. He's saying, put it on hold. I might go to a fuller panel of judges at the D.C. Circuit. I might go to the Supreme Court with my appeal. The Supreme Court has the option of granting that, keeping the trial on hold while they sort that out, turning it down, which means that the trial goes forward. Or the court could say, you know, we're just going to actually treat this like an appeal, and we're going to go ahead and take up this case and decide whether or not you're right on immunity.
That said, considering really the urgent nature of the request here in the throes of an actual presidential campaign, is the Supreme Court compelled to act quickly here?
It's not compelled. They're aware of what's going on. You know, one of the interesting dynamics about this is we all know there's a campaign. We know there's an election coming up. But it's not something that Jack Smith has been arguing because he doesn't want to be giving the appearance of, I want to get a conviction before the election. He's talking about the urgency because it's such an important issue. But the justices will know that. We're seeing them move very quickly in that other big case they have, the case involving the Colorado, whether he can be on the ballot in Colorado. So I would imagine whatever they do here, it will be fast.
Well, to your point on Colorado, its primary is on Super Tuesday, March 5th. It's coming up pretty quickly, and they theoretically would need to decide whether Trump's going to appear on a ballot before then. Is it likely that the court is going to want to get that buttoned up before they deal with this immunity question?
I'm not sure if it's do one and then do the other. They're going to see both of these cases kind of at the same time. Undoubtedly, they're busily writing whatever opinion or opinions they're writing now. I'm anticipating that ruling will happen very quickly, whether it's before Super Tuesday or not, hard to say. And they'll be able to, think about that at the same time they're thinking about this. And it may well be we end up in a world where Donald Trump can be on the ballot, but a criminal trial goes forward and the voters will decide what it all means.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to be an interesting week for this president, former president, I should say, in Donald Trump as he waits to hear on this Manhattan case as well. It's likely then Stormy Daniels is the first case that is held in this series of criminal cases, yes?
Yeah, that's certainly possible. That's obviously, Jack Smith is still trying very hard to get this trial to go forward. There was a March 4th trial date. Yeah. That's not going to happen. That's been suspended. It's certainly possible. There's a world in which if the court acts very quickly, rejects Donald Trump here, the trial could happen not too long after that. And in a lot of ways, that's really the biggest one because it goes right to the heart of the alleged efforts to overturn the election.
Thanks for helping us decipher all of this. It's great to see you again. Greg Stohr with us on Balance of Power. Elsewhere, former President Trump saying he would abandon NATO members to a Russian incursion if the allies fail to meet defense spending commitments. Let's turn now to Bloomberg's Dan Flatley for more on this. Comments on the campaign trail, Dan, in South Carolina receiving condemnation from around the world, including Jens Stoltenberg himself, the Secretary General at NATO.
Yes, I mean, you can imagine how these comments were greeted by the U.S.'s allies in Europe. This type of rhetoric goes back a long way with former President Donald Trump, as you well know, Joe. I think what has changed now, obviously, in 2024 versus when he was making these sorts of comments in 2018 and 2019 is that the U.S. is engaged in certainly an economic campaign against Russia in Ukraine, but is supplying the Ukrainian military with a lot of arms, a lot of hardware, a lot of financial support. And there are countries neighboring Ukraine that are very nervous about what would happen if Ukraine should fall ultimately, and could they be next? And could there be an incursion onto a NATO country by Russia? So this is very much a live issue, so a bit of a different context from when we've heard this before.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, while we're paying attention to geopolitical conflict in Europe, what that could potentially mean for NATO allies, we're also paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East after Israel's operations in Rafah over the weekend, that southern part of the Gaza Strip, where they were able to extract 2 hostages. But there has been great concern about potential civilian casualties that could result from Israel's action there. And this is something that National Security Council spokesman John Kirby spoke about earlier today.
I've also seen reports that civilians were killed over the weekend in Rafah due to Israeli operations. I can't confirm those reports, but as we have said many times, the proper number of civilian casualties is 0. We don't want to see a single innocent civilian death, Israeli or Palestinian. But let me be clear, there can be no enduring end to this crisis until Hamas releases the men and women that they are holding hostage, all of them.
And Dan, of course, today, right now, in fact, President Biden is meeting at the White House with King Abdullah II from Jordan, the king saying we can't afford Israel's attack on Rafah, while Biden was saying they're working to open other humanitarian corridors in Gaza, considering the Rafah Gate was one of those main ones. It seems like the Biden administration is trying to take a tougher stance here on Israel and what it's doing. What's your read?
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, the Biden administration is coming under enormous pressure at this point, not just from Republicans on doing more for Israel potentially, but also from Democrats who want to see the Biden administration really press the Israeli government on these potential civilian casualties. Just a few minutes before we came on air, Senator Chris Van Hollen, a Democrat of Maryland, was on the Senate floor talking about how Biden really needs to press the Israeli government on this. So the calls for this type of thing will increase in the coming days. But what's happening in Gaza and what's happening with Israel is connected to what's happening with Ukraine and with Russia, because the funding for those two conflicts is connected at this point on Capitol Hill. So there's going to be a little bit of three-dimensional chess that the Biden administration is going to have to play in order to get some of that funding through for Ukraine, which they want, for Israel, which they want, but also try to put some pressure on the Israeli government to reduce civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip.
All right, Dan Flatley, thank you so much. Now turning to Congress, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer discussing the supplemental aid package they're going to try to pass this week earlier on the Senate floor.
Over the weekend, the Senate took the significant step towards passing the National Security Supplemental by voting last night on cloture on the substitute 6727. By now, we have taken numerous procedural votes that prove beyond doubt that there's strong support behind this bill. It's time to finish the job.
Joining us now is Kate Ackley from Bloomberg Government, who covers Congress for us. So, Kate, obviously you're seeing numbers north of 60, the requisite number to pass these procedural motions. We saw them working on Super Bowl Tuesday to advance this further. It's going to be a question, though, of what the final vote tally ultimately is in the Senate, what kind of mandate, therefore, it would give the House as it considers what it wants to do with this measure.
Absolutely right. The House is still the big question, and it's not clear that something that includes aid for Ukraine, aid for Israel, and this other stuff can even get through the House. I mean, there are all kinds of procedural things. You know, people talk about doing a discharge petition so you can put a bill on the House floor that doesn't have leadership support. But, you know, there's just a lot of murkiness about how this is all going to go down, and you did see senators working over the weekend, including during the Super Bowl, to try to get this thing over the finish line, to try to send a big bipartisan message. But it's still unclear. And there is a lot of political division that has emerged even in the last few months.
Well, how this does go down remains a big question in the Senate, but especially in the House. I talked to Bill Hoagland earlier today from the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, and spent many years working in the Senate about what might happen next. Here he is.
The 30 hours post the vote on Sunday will run out on Wednesday, and by then they will pass it. It's clear it's going to go over to the House. The new speaker is trying to figure out himself as to what strategy he wants to pursue. I believe that there are clearly, if it was put to a vote in the House of Representatives, it would overwhelmingly pass. So there are various approaches he could take.
Isn't that incredible? And that's been the case really through this whole debate surrounding Ukraine. If it actually got to the floor, there would be probably enough Democrats and Republicans to make this happen. So the speaker's got a tough choice here. Could his career be on the line?
It seems like his career is on the line every day on everything.
Sure,
you know, we talk about that on numerous issues. So, yes, definitely it is. But, you know, there's going to be a lot of pressure that will just continue to build. But you've seen, like we saw just a few minutes ago, where you have Democrats who are concerned about some of the things that are happening in Gaza, criticizing Israel. You know, the longer this drags on, the more sort of politically fragile some of these alliances get. But yes, Speaker Johnson, I'm sure, understands that he's got a lot of important divisions from his own conference that he'll have to contend with if he were to put this on the floor.
So we're back in a world potentially, Kaylee, where this passes the Senate and goes nowhere.
Yeah.
Big thanks to Bloomberg's Kate Ackley and the rest of our reporters today. Coming up, GOP presidential hopeful Nikki Haley sat down with Bloomberg to talk tariffs, Trump, and the race for the White House. We'll have highlights from that conversation next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I said, you got to pay up. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want.
There's the line. Former President Donald Trump speaking over the weekend in South Carolina. Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley responded to those remarks earlier on Bloomberg Surveillance.
Do we want NATO to pay more? Of course we do. But the last thing we're going to do is side with a thug. Keep in mind, Putin kills his opponents. Keep in mind that he has arrested Evan Gersovich, who's been sitting in jail just for doing journalism. Keep in mind that this is a man who has wanted to destroy America and defeat America for years. I dealt with Russia every single day. It is a mistake for Trump to side with Putin over our allies. We needed a lot of friends after 9/11. We better remember that. But it takes a friend to get a friend.
Last summer, you spoke to this network about ways to combat rising debt. I've got the transcript in front of me. My colleague Joe Matthew asked you, how would you manage the entitlements to try and get our arms around soaring debt? Your answer, any candidate that says they're not going to touch entitlements, they're basically going to go into office and leave America bankrupt. One option you offered, we changed retirement age to reflect life expectancy. Your original answer is now part of Trump campaign ads. Is that still something you want to do?
Well, first of all, that's not what I said. What I said is we should not ever take away from those who have invested in and those who have been promised. America should always keep their promises. I said we should go and change the rules for those in their 20s. That's the problem. Those in their 20s, like my kids, for them, we should change the retirement age to life expectancy. Instead of cost of living increases, we should do increases based on inflation. We should cap the benefits on the mega wealthy, and we should expand Medicare Advantage plans. What Donald Trump wants to do is he doesn't want to touch it so that when Social Security goes bankrupt in 10 years, everybody gets a 24% cut across the board. That's not how you handle a problem. I'm going to count it. The thing you do is you get in front of the problem. When we make those changes, that's when you start focusing on what it takes to make sure not only does everybody who've paid in keep what they get, but you make sure that our kids will actually have something when the time comes for them as well. We have to take that seriously, and we have to stop having Congress raid the Social Security accounts. Right now, they're raiding all of those accounts instead of stopping the wasteful spending. We'll stop the spending, stop the borrowing, eliminate the pet projects, and I'll veto any spending bill that doesn't take us back to pre-COVID levels.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump is talking about heavily tariffing Chinese goods, potentially up to 40%. Do you see this as one viable way to raise money?
Absolutely not. All that does is raise taxes on the American families and our small businesses that we need to be taken care of. It is ludicrous that he wants to go and raise those tariffs to everything that we import. That's going to affect American families on anything from baby strollers to appliances. Every American family will see at least a $2,800 increase in their taxes. Not only that, not only does he want to cut Social Security by 24% in 10 years, he wanted to raise the gas tax by 25 cents per gallon in 2018. He doesn't understand the value of a taxpayer dollar. He doesn't understand that you don't go in debt. You don't tax the American people. You don't go and take care of big corporations. You take care of small businesses and American families by making sure they have more cash that they can spend. That's been what's lost not only in Donald Trump, but in Joe Biden and in every member of Congress.
That was Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley speaking earlier on Bloomberg Surveillance. Now, at the White House press briefing earlier today, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby also reacted to Trump's comments on NATO.
You've heard from President Biden, gosh, I don't know how many times. We will defend, if needed, every inch of NATO territory. That's what the Commander-in-Chief of the United States ought to be saying when it comes to NATO.
Let's bring in now retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. So on the one hand, you have the Biden administration today saying we will defend every inch of NATO territory. On the other, you have Donald Trump essentially saying not only would he allow Russia to do whatever it wants to NATO allies, he would encourage them to do so. How damaging is just that rhetoric, even if it never comes to fruition?
Well, I think after 4 years of President Trump, everybody sort of recognizes that rhetoric. But unfortunately, behind that rhetoric, there is some logic. NATO is candidly been freeloading off the United States for years and years, and every president since Eisenhower has said the same thing.
Not that you would allow one of our allies to fall prey to a Russian invasion, though. That's a separate conversation, is it not?
Well, it is, but it's also the fact that President Trump then and future President Trump, if that happens, can't pull us out of NATO. So it's quite simply that he doesn't have that choice. Plus, there are already about 50,000 American troops over there. What, he's not going to come to their rescue? Ridiculous.
Well, you say that he wouldn't have the choice to pull out of NATO. Obviously, there has been actual legislation that has passed that would make it a congressional act necessarily to do so. But couldn't he, as commander-in-chief, theoretically give the order for troops not to go or not order them to go if the articles of NATO were actually to be invoked, if a country like Poland or one of the Baltic states actually were invaded by Russia? He could just not send them, even if he was still in NATO, right?
But let's get back to the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue that President Trump continues to refer to as a businessman is, as he would say, we're being taken for suckers. The combined GDP of 31 nations in NATO is $1.2 billion, not the GDP, but the defense budget, $1.2 billion. Of which the United States pays $800 billion of that. So 30 nations pay $4, we pay $8. So I think there is an issue with regards to how much is the fair balance between what we pay and what others should pay, and are, in fact, our NATO allies free riders on the United States defense budget. That's the point he's making, even if it is somewhat inelegant as it has been in the past.
Well, if you take him at face value, I'm not sure you do based on your answer, and a lot of people might question whether he ever said that to begin with, as he's kind of, in a room there where he might be showing off in front of supporters. But Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, said was very upset about this for obvious reasons in a statement. Any suggestion allies will not defend each other undermines all of our security, including that of the U.S. That is true, isn't it?
Well, again, it's a suggestion. It's a hypothetical. It is the campaign season. We all say odd things during a campaign season. Joe Biden last time said Mohammed bin Salman was a murderer, and now they're having a bromance.
Oh, it's amazing how things can change.
It's amazing how things can change.
What's Joe Biden's line? He believes in conversion. But as far as what Stoltenberg said, the U.S. does rely on its NATO allies for security. No?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we would not be able to support Ukraine without our NATO allies. I spent 10 years of my Army career overseas in a NATO function of one kind or the other. We certainly recognize the great contributions of those 30 other countries. But as a businessman, Donald Trump doesn't like to be, as he would say, gypped. And he just feels like they're not living up to their commitments. And candidly, every president since Eisenhower has said the same thing.
Well, you say also that a lot of this is just down to campaign rhetoric, but that would mean that this messaging actually appeals to voters. Do you think that this is reflective of a United States as an electorate that is becoming more isolationist? And what does that mean about the future world order?
No, I think that's a good point. Yes, Americans, by and large, are becoming more isolationist. But at the same time, when you appeal to pocketbook issues, then it really strikes home. And that's what he is doing in this case, that somehow, why do we have to bear the burdens when those great social welfare systems in Europe have universal health care, but we're still struggling with our own health care systems? Imagine if we only paid $400 billion and they paid $400 billion. That $400 billion savings in our defense budget could go pretty far to universal health care.
General, we have to ask you about what's happening in Israel and Gaza right now.
Thank you.
Airstrikes move to the south, to Rafah, and some very new levels of concern, I guess you could say, inside the administration about potential civilian casualties. Dozens of civilians have already died. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke on Sunday morning about their efforts in southern Gaza. I'd like to listen to what he said and have you respond. Here he is.
Those who say that under no circumstances should we enter Rafah are basically saying, lose the war, keep Hamas there. Victory is within reach. It has to be understood. And victory will be the best thing that will happen, not only for Israel, but for the Palestinians themselves. I can't see a future for the Palestinians or for peace in the Middle East if Hamas is victorious.
The concern here is, of course, so many civilians have fled to that area as strikes were contained largely to the north before. President Biden says Israel should not push into Rafah without a credible and executable plan for the safety of civilians. Does such a thing exist?
Well, that's exactly what the Israeli military has been tasked to come up with. The question is, will Prime Minister Netanyahu give the military time to not only set up that plan, but execute it? And it's not just about getting 1.2 million people out of Rafah. It's also making sure they have somewhere to go, they have shelter, they have water, they have food. And if that is done, it will delay this attack considerably. If it is not done, I can tell you as a military officer, I wouldn't want to be putting my troops in the middle of Rafah with 1.2 million people in an area that one-third the size of Manhattan. Can you imagine trying to fight in that kind of environment? Impossible.
We have less than a minute left, but do you see Rafah as key to Israel's ability to win this war against Hamas, whatever winning means?
Winning is, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, the defeat of Hamas, the destruction of its terrorist infrastructure, the return of the hostages. I don't know about the third issue, but if you don't take Rafah, you don't defeat Hamas, you don't destroy the terrorist infrastructure.
General, thank you. It's good to see retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, Nick Akerman, the former U.S. Assistant Attorney, former Watergate prosecutor, joins to talk about Donald Trump's latest legal hurdles and news today from the Supreme Court. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think personally, and I believe I'm in the minority of constitutionalists on this, that there's a strong likelihood that they will not take the case. The Court of Appeals opinion is dispositive. There's really nothing to add to the jurisprudence here. The Supreme Court may feel it has to have the last word, but if they don't, the decision of the D.C. Circuit is, an epic, well-reasoned, consequential opinion.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Former President Trump has asked the Supreme Court to keep his 2020 election trial on hold, seeking time to appeal the ruling, rejecting his bid for immunity as he continues to campaign for his return to the White House. That was Ty Cobb, the former special counsel to the White House in the Trump administration. To take us through all of this, it gets a little bit complicated, and we turn to Nick Akerman for help, the former U.S. Assistant Attorney, former Watergate prosecutor. It's great to see you, Mr. Akerman. Now that Donald Trump is asking the court, what will the justices do?
Well, what he's asking for is a stay, meaning to put the whole case on ice while he tries to appeal the ruling of the D.C. Circuit. My feeling is the same as Mr. Cobb's. I just don't see the Supreme Court staying this action for a number of reasons. One, as he said, Mr. Cobb said, this is an extremely well-reasoned opinion. It goes over 57 pages. There's really not much more to say. They really took real care in analyzing and addressing every single issue that was raised by Donald Trump. I mean, the bottom line is there's really nothing to this issue. I mean, back in Watergate, for example, nobody ever thought that Richard Nixon had immunity from prosecution. That was never something that we even gave one instant of thought to. Secondly, I think Donald Trump's timing here is bad. It's terrible in the sense that they already have this case that they had no choice but to take on the 14th Amendment as to whether or not Donald Trump is barred from appearing on the ballot because of his involvement in the insurrection. I think the last thing this Supreme Court wants is to get more involved in the presidential election in 2024, that they're not going to be looking to do this. And they've already got problems up to their eyeballs with the 14th Amendment. So it doesn't seem to me they're going to have the appetite to take this. And on top of it, there's also the option that they have if and when Donald Trump is convicted in the District of Columbia case, which I think is highly likely, they'll have another opportunity to address this issue on appeal.
Okay, so Nick, let's talk about that, because if, as you say, the court decides not to stay this, to allow the trial to be rescheduled and proceed as normal, what kind of timeline would we be looking at in that scenario? Not just for the trial to begin, but actually the duration of it, knowing that it is just Trump who is a defendant in this case. There's only 4 counts that he's been charged with by Jack Smith. How long would the actual trial process, ultimately a verdict, and then a conviction sentencing actually take, knowing that the election is coming in November?
Well, first of all, the sentencing always occurs some 3 months after the conviction. So what we're looking at in terms of the trial and the actual verdict, we're probably looking at about 4 to 6 weeks. It's not a very complicated case. It's mainly made up of various witnesses and tape recordings of Donald Trump. It's going to take some time, but it's a lot easier than some of these other cases like the classified document case or the RICO case in Georgia, where Trump is the only defendant. I think if, as I suspect, the Supreme Court denies cert on this, meaning they will not take the appeal, they will not grant the stay, I think what we're going to see is that the case will be set down sometime maybe in mid-April. That will give Alan Bragg the opportunity to go ahead on, I believe it's March 25th that the trial is scheduled to go. That's a 3-week trial. So they could go right from that trial right into the District of Columbia. So I think that's probably what we're looking at this point.
So that timeline would suggest then that Alvin Bragg, I think if I understand you correctly, Mr. Akerman, Alvin Bragg gets the first crack here. That will be the first trial. And you've gone out of your way to make the point that that could be much more important for Donald Trump's legal future and political future than a lot of folks have made that out to be. Many have spent time questioning the legitimacy of that case.
No, that's a very solid case. I mean, what people are overlooking is the fact that this case is about election interference again. It's about Donald Trump concealing information from the voting public in 2016 that if they had known about, he would have likely have lost. So it's really not that much different than what you've got in 2020, where Donald Trump basically lies to stay in power and comes up with a big lie that the election was rigged. So in a sense, both of these are related. And if you were to go in chronological order, it would make sense to do the Alan Bragg case first.
Well, and of course, we've now talked about 2 of the felony cases the former president is facing. There's 2 others, one in Georgia and one in Florida. In the documents case that has come to front of mind in light of the release yesterday of the DOJ's report on President Biden's handling of classified documents, Special Counsel Robert Hur did not charge the president with anything, even though he said he willfully retained classified documents, knowing that 31 counts that Trump is charged with in Florida are willful retention of national security information. Do you think the fact that Biden wasn't charged on those counts could have implications for that case? We're talking 31 of the 91 felonies that Trump is charged with.
Absolutely no, there's no similarity between the 2. And also, I might add, if you read through that opinion, the special counsel concludes that there was not willful retention of these documents in several places in that report. But this is completely apples and oranges. Donald Trump lied. He basically obfuscated. He obstructed the FBI from getting these documents. He had his attorneys lie. I mean, the real problem that Donald Trump has in that case in Florida is his obstruction of justice count. That's what really puts it over the top. If he had simply, right from the get-go, had given all those documents back and said, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, and just turned them all over, but he didn't do that. Instead, he had his lawyers lie. He had his employees lie. He hid documents. It's a whole different case. Joe Biden came forward. He produced the documents. He told the government he had them. It's a completely different situation.
All right. Well, thank you, as always, for providing your legal expertise and analysis. We appreciate your time. Nick Akerman, former U.S. Assistant Attorney. Now, still coming up, Trump's stance toward NATO is gaining backlash. We'll be joined by our political panel with all of the details and reaction. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Former President Donald Trump being criticized for his comments at a rally over the weekend, questioning U.S. commitments to defending NATO allies. Our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, are joining us now with more. So, Rick, the direct quote was that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell it wants to allies, specifically the ones that are not spending enough of their budgets, essentially, on NATO. Obviously, he is running against Nikki Haley in a primary campaign in which she very much is trying to tout her foreign policy experience. She was on Bloomberg TV earlier today, really trying to make this distinction. Does this hurt him as he's campaigning?
Yeah, look, there is an element of his support that is very pro-military. And South Carolina has the largest number of veterans per capita in the country. So it's a target-rich environment if Nikki Haley is able to make the case that she represents them
better than he does. And I think the whole controversy mixed into that is his attacks on her husband, who's deployed right now. And he's like, where is she? Where is he? Where is he? And so I think those things combined brings it right back to South Carolina, and it is really difficult for Trump supporters to articulate like why this isn't bad behavior, why this isn't outside the norm, why this isn't controversial to honoring our people in the military. So I think she's got a leg up on this one.
Well, how does she take advantage of that then in a more forceful way, Jeannie? I don't know if you believe Donald Trump even said that. Not sure a lot of people believe that he said it, but that's, of course, not what matters here. I just wonder, was he trying to draw her out? And how does she seize on this without taking the bait?
Well, she already just released today an ad in South Carolina. To Rick's point, it is rich with people in the military, family, friends, parents, others. And this is going to be a problem for him. You know, it is head-scratching to imagine. I think we're so used to Donald Trump saying outrageous things. It's head-scratching to imagine how any of this helps him, because the reality is he needs to win the presidency by winning moderates and independents. And there is no way in which attacks on somebody's husband serving overseas in the military is helpful in this regard. Neither is it helpful to say Russia run in and attack our allies. You know, there is a conversation to be had in a respectful manner about potentially how much we pay and how much our NATO allies pay. That's a conversation to be had. But the way he has these conversations is chaotic and off-putting to people in the middle. That's what Nikki Haley's saying. But the real person this is going to help is Joe Biden, because he had a very bad weekend, very bad end of the week. And Donald Trump just took the oxygen right out of that and turned all the focus on himself.
Yeah, and you're certainly hearing reaction from some of our allies to that today, Germany and others. Speaking of our allies, of course, this is also coming against a backdrop of Congress considering whether or not it wants to advance a supplemental aid package for allies, including Israel and Ukraine. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke about this on the Senate floor earlier.
These are enormously high stakes of the national security package. Our security, our values, our democracy. It's a down payment for the survival of Western democracy and the survival of American values. The entire world is going to remember what the Senate does in the next few days.
Rick, does Trump's words over the weekend about NATO have an impact on ultimately how difficult or much easier it is to get this package through both chambers of Congress?
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation that he said those things to turn the heat up on Republicans, you know, and try to distance themselves from this vote. But I think it actually is starting to create a boomerang effect where Republicans see that kind of behavior and they say, well, there's plenty of room to live within this, you know, encouraging Putin to invade NATO countries and supporting the NATO country of Ukraine in this case. And I think it actually is resulting in some Republicans, especially those in the House, who are hawkish when it comes to national security affairs, kind of giving him a pass, saying, well, you know, I can't make him happy on this comment today, but I've got to make myself happy on being able to support a NATO country. So I think he's actually doing himself some harm, assuming that he wants to try to beat back this funding bill.
I'd love to talk with you guys about what actually happened on Super Bowl Sunday. It was a working Super Bowl Sunday, we understand, for the first time ever in the history of the Senate. This procedural vote is important, 67 to 27. That's not 80, that's not 90, Rick. Does it give us a sense of what happens with any level of momentum if this gets to the floor?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that is momentum. Just to get something passed out of the Senate would be considered momentum. Right. I mean, we were doing last rites over this whole initiative 2 or 3 times in the last, 6 months. So the fact that a bill will go out that fully funds these strategic needs of these countries and humanitarian needs, there's $9 billion of humanitarian assistance in that, will really catch the House by surprise, because I don't think they thought they were ever going to have to deal with this.
Well, in the House, the big question, Jeannie, is ultimately if this comes to the floor, what that means for Speaker Mike Johnson when there are members like Marjorie Taylor Greene who have threatened a motion to vacate if he puts the issue of Ukraine aid up for a vote. Would it be prudent for Democrats here to come out and say, unlike with Speaker McCarthy, Speaker Johnson, we will protect you if you allow us to pass this?
Absolutely. I think they should. I hope they do. This funding is needed. They should get on board. If there is a motion to vacate, they should support Johnson in this regard. This is critical, not just as an electoral issue. It's critical for our future, and Democrats know that, and they must help move it forward. So I do hope they do that. But no question, the Speaker is in an awful pickle on this situation. He knows the seriousness. He supports the funding, and yet his job is threatened if this goes forward. That is quite a set of circumstances for a relatively untested Speaker to be under.
I was struck, Rick, by the words of Mitch McConnell over the weekend as he's trying to figure out what's going on here. Quote, "I know it's become quite fashionable in some circles to disregard the global interests we have as a global power." And he went on to talk about lamenting the commitment that has underpinned the longest drought of great power conflict in human history. He's perplexed by what's going on, but this will pass his chamber. After that, it's anyone's guess.
Yeah, look, I mean, the Speaker has said he supports Ukraine aid, not necessarily in this fashion. He supported Israel aid by trying to actually pass an Israeli funding bill. He couldn't get that through his own caucus. So, I mean, here's a chance where he can redeem himself, get on the world stage and say, I'm doing the job that the American people sent me here to do. Yeah. He has a vast majority of people who will pass this bill if they have a chance to vote for it.
We have some breaking news that I just want to mention before we move any further, and it's courtesy ABC News. An investigation is underway right now after 6 people were reportedly shot at a subway station in the Bronx. This at the Mount Eden train station and happened a short time ago this afternoon. We'll keep you posted as we learn more. We'll have much more with our political panel coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. That was an ad supporting RFK Jr. that ran during yesterday's Super Bowl game. Cost some money. Mr. Kennedy later issued an apology for that advertisement, said his campaign was not involved. It came from the Super PAC. And we're back now with our political panel. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. They were peeking out of one eye this morning like the rest of us because they, too, were watching the Super Bowl. And I wonder what you think here, Jeannie, seizing on that Kennedy name. Is this as simple as spell the name right? Did he pull a fast one here? What about no communication with the Super PAC? Did he really not know this was going to be on television?
Yeah, he's not supposed to legally, so I think he'll stick to that. But as you know, has been discussed, he had this pinned up to the top of his social media. So despite the apology, he seems to want to drive it forward. And there's a big wrinkle here. I mean, this PAC, who pays $7 million for an ad for somebody who doesn't have much of a pathway forward? Well, the PAC is led by a Trump supporter paying the $7 million. Is this some kind of plan to see if Trump can peel some unsuspecting Democrats away from Joe Biden? He's going to need to do that to win the general. So I think we have to stay tuned for what this means, because so far RFK, he's only on the ballot in Utah. So he doesn't have a lot of ground to go forward. But he can hurt Joe Biden, and this may be the plan.
Well, and Rick, there's been a lot more chatter in recent days about the idea that perhaps the Biden campaign needs to go after RFK more aggressively. Are they underappreciating the threat he may pose?
Yeah, I think that you never can allow someone to grow within a political dynamic like that might actually take away potential voters of yours. And so even though the numbers today, when you look, are pretty much the same with him in the race versus with him out, he is getting independent voters. And Joe Biden is going to desperately need those same independent voters to look in his direction, not in a different direction, if he hopes to beat Donald Trump based on the numbers we see today. So, yeah, he's gumming up the works in some of these places. But as Jeannie said, there are structural requirements. He's got to get on these ballots in Michigan and Arizona and Georgia and places like that. It's not going to hurt Joe Biden a bit if he loses Utah to Donald Trump.
Donald Trump is still seizing on Social Security as an issue to use against Nikki Haley. Kaylee, we interviewed Nikki Haley back in August when we asked a question about the Social Security retirement age, and it's still showing up in ads. Here's the latest that the former president, posted to Truth Social over the weekend.
Nikki Haley clearly said she plans to change the rules and raise the age of Social Security. This results in cutting benefits for 82% of Americans.
Bob, that was a rookie mistake by Haley.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Is this good politics? Rick, you've asked for a lot of ads to be made in your time. I'm getting a sense that he wouldn't be making them still if it wasn't working and testing well with voters.
Yeah, I think there are two things there. One, exactly what you say, tests as well with voters, so sure, he knows that makes sense. And two, he's spending money on Nikki Haley. If he didn't feel threatened by her, he would not be spending money, even though he can. And so the reality is she might be getting some traction in South Carolina, because otherwise, why would you bother running an ad against Nikki Haley around the Super Bowl?
Well, maybe he's threatened a bit by Nikki Haley. It seems he also, Jeannie, feels a little threatened by a potential conspiracy theory that Taylor Swift comes out and endorses Joe Biden. The Chiefs did win the Super Bowl last night. No endorsement has come. You did get the Dark Brandon tweet from Biden saying it's just like he drew it up. But can we call this done and dusted now? The Super Bowl's over.
Yeah, it should be, hopefully, for all of our sakes. Although I will note that Donald Trump, didn't he he took sort of responsibility for Taylor Swift's success and said she should be thanking him. So, you know, I don't know if it's going to end soon. He really wants a thank you and support from her, I think.
Can you explain this to me again? So they thought that Taylor Swift was a psyop?
Yes.
Who simply through the relationship would somehow result in a Super Bowl victory and then rush to the field and endorse Joe Biden.
Together with Travis Kelce. Make a big thing of it.
The Kelce Swift endorsement.
Right.
None of that happened, although they did win, to your point. So I guess that was wrong.
I guess so. And on that note, we will leave it. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you very much for joining us on the Monday post-Super Bowl. To quote the former president, he likes her boyfriend Travis, even though he may be a liberal and probably can't stand me.
He actually wrote that.
Yes, on True Social.
He was typing away during the Super Bowl. I'm sure they'll get along someday. We're going to see ourselves out now. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.